Good evening and welcome. My name is Corinne DeBray and I'm a managing director here at the Foster. Thank you so much for coming. Tonight's guest artist explorer is Robert Bultmann. He's a celebrated fine art photographer whose works connect audiences to subjects in an emotionally transcendent manner in the tradition of Eastern wisdom and Western revelation. Whether exploring the spirit of the landscape or inquiring into the design of life, his work is a powerful extraction of beauty and substance, revealing unrecognized dimensions in the commonplace. It's true. I've seen his work. I've had the pleasure of touring his studio, and it's really remarkable. Our speaker grew up in Woodside, and from his home, he could look out to the Santa Cruz Mountains, where he could see the canyons and redwoods, and the ocean fog slipping over the hills, which I think really influenced his work and his probably love for nature as well. He's published 17 photographic collections, and again, 3 books, The Unseen Peninsula, 18 Days in June, and Signs of Life. And then he was taking a series of black and white photographs that were really beautiful. This is how I first saw his work. He was one of the primary photographers for the Peninsula Open Space Trust. And so his photographs graced the publications of that organization, and I think inspired people to really support the work that was happening there. So he was becoming more and more well-known for this beautiful work, these contemplative landscapes. And then in 1999, he decided to go off in a little bit different direction. And so I'm really looking forward to him talking about his cameraless work, his photograms, so I don't want to spoil that, but that's really exciting. But there's so much I can say about him, and I think I've talked long enough, that I think I'm going to cut it short and just say that in addition to Post, he's also worked with Semper Virens Fund, Gerasi Residence Artist Program, San Mateo County Parks Foundation, Stanford Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. He's gotten awards from the U.S. Congress, Commonwealth of California, Committee for Green Foothills, NRDC. So he's got quite a prestigious background and following, deservedly so. Please give me some assistance in giving a warm welcome to Robert Buelteman. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. And thank you all for coming tonight. It's a real privilege to have such a nice crowd. I also want to thank Ann Baxter and Jill and Jeff, whose relationship with my work allowed me to be here tonight. So it's very special. I'm one of the lucky people who's had the privilege of growing up here on the San Francisco Peninsula. And I'm honored tonight to be part of this speaker series, and I'll take you along for a little bit of the ride that's been my life. Tonight I'm going to speak about landscape art, about what it has taught me about my own life and my own internal landscape. My story is nowhere near as exciting as Mr. Foster's, but I thought I'd share a little bit of it with you to give you some idea about what gave rise to my work in photography. I was born of 2 explorers. Here I am, 1955, for the traditional family portrait. My parents were 2 explorers who were also dreamers. My mother dreamed of having an education and was the first in her family to have a college degree, which allowed her to escape the brutal poverty of the Deep South in which she was raised. My father was an extraordinary person as well. By the time he was 23 years old, he had crossed the Atlantic Ocean 50 times, sextant and slide rule in hand, during the war effort. He once told me when I was a young man that if you haven't crashed at least 4 airplanes, you're not really a pilot. I spent most of my life here on the San Francisco Peninsula and know it well. Growing up in Woodside overlooking the Crystal Springs watershed from the hill that now has Kenyatta College, I told my father when I was a little boy, I want to go back there, back behind those fences, and he told me no one was allowed there, so of course I was hooked. 20 years later, I would spend over 10 years exploring behind those fences, and the work I did ended up being published as my book, The Unseen Peninsula. Exploration has always been a motivating curiosity, both in my life personally and in my art. Let's take a quick look at some of those explorations. For 25 years, I made most of the photographs for the Peninsula Open Space Trust. When I first met Audrey Rust, it was her and 2 volunteers in an office a little bigger than the podium here. And they've now raised hundreds of millions of dollars and preserved tens of thousands of acres here on the San Francisco Peninsula. I served in as advisory board member on Sempervirens Fund, for Sempervirens Fund, California's oldest land trust, making this piece in 1993 as part of their Butano Park Crossing series, naming it for my wife, Julie's Island. I enjoyed 9 residencies now at the Jurassic Resident Artist Program. This sculpture by Bruce Johnson, titled Tori, I imaged under the full moon, using an exposure several hours long to capture the stars wheeling. I also served as artist in residence at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico for 4 years. This is one of the many images I made during that time, Aspen Turning, a collection of 50 leaves from 50 different aspen trees collected on a drive from Durango, Colorado to Santa Fe. These were made with no cameras, no lenses, and no computers. More recently, I was honored to be a guest at Stanford at their Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve, where I made this image, Jasper Oak. This place, our peninsula, is a place I know with my feet. I am what poet, essayist, farmer, and author Wendell Berry would call a placed person, and the San Francisco Peninsula is my home. One of my earliest memories was the razing of the forest behind my family's home to make way for Interstate 280 when I was in grade school. I remember the horror of seeing Caterpillar tractors roll over the land that was my special place. I was too naive in 6th grade to understand that just because my friends and I played there, that it didn't belong to us, and we couldn't control what happened to it. That seed of indignation and outrage lay dormant in my life for many years during my high school and college education. And long after my family moved away from the north side of town to avoid the freeway, that seed of indignation lived on. I could have never imagined that decades later I would make this image, 280 Sunrise, as an homage to the integration of man, machine, and nature. Bucky Fuller once wrote that man is born with feet and not roots. His principal advantage as a species is mobility. And while that's true, it also leaves our kind vulnerable to the erroneous perspective that we're separate from the world around us, that we stand alone and are individual, much as most of us see the bee as separate from the flower and the fruit that that flower might become. Had we come into the world bearing roots, our manifold connections to our planet would be too obvious, more obvious than we would need to explain. But that's not the case. This notion that the world belongs to us is pervasive. Indeed, it's not a notion at all. It's not even a thought. It is the ground of being from which we think. It's where we think from. So we live in an illusion, as is revealed in our language. Even the best and brightest of my enlightened environmental friends, we speak of saving our planet. Such hubris, such arrogance we human beings have. Until we understand and behave that the world does not belong to us, its degradation will continue apace. So, given this species-wide myopia, what's the job of the artist whose concern is the fate of our species? And I say our species because the world will go on whether we are along for the ride or not. I think most successful artists work to make distinctions in their work that provide us with new eyes with which to see. Here's a typical example from my recent 10 days at the Jurassic Resident Artist Program. We're all familiar with the beauty of the peacock feather. The iridescence of the green and blue colors are so captivating that when you behold a peacock feather, it fills your entire awareness. It's all we think about. However, by removing the colors and placing the form in a different context, in this case, a piece of cyanotype paper, we become aware of another kind of beauty, the beauty of symmetry and the simplicity of a design structure. So, for any given subject, there are so many possibilities that I think I'll use the work of Mr. Foster and my own to talk a little bit about how I see the artistic world. In being asked, what's this all about, Tony's response, it was about the human need to revere certain places in the world. Very honest and straightforward. This piece, 23 Days Painting the Canyon, makes distinct the color, breadth, and depth of the canyon. But then Foster takes us deeper by adding artifacts that were collected during his trip, in this case an arrowhead. Right next to it, a slice of topographic map showing the viewer exactly where the easel was set up at the time he made the painting. And to finish it off, a stripped painting of artifacts seen but not collected during his foray into the canyon. In the same way, looking 70 degrees east-northeast from Macupacare, with its little statue of Shiva, the map, and these beautiful colored sands, which the monks do their sand paintings with. It pulls you in a way that few other watercolors could. Tony uses a specific time, a specific place to transport the viewer and inspire us in our sense of awe and wonder. There is a continuum in art, and it has a number of different names, from the documentary to the utterly abstract. And you can place most artists somewhere along that continuum. Tony, along with 19th century photographers Edward Muybridge, Carlton Watkins, as well as all of the landscape painters of the time, their job was very simple. It was to make the inaccessible accessible. At the time Muybridge made this photograph, he knew that the likelihood of his peers ever gazing into the Yosemite Valley was approximately zero. So the job was to make faithful renderings, to bring them back, to give people the chance to study, experience the place, and to have it be part of their awareness. And of course, he was working with wet plate collodion glass plates, where you would have a plate of glass, you would have to paint the light surface material on it and use it within 5 minutes. Otherwise, if it dries, you need an exposure time about 10 times as long. So this was all done out of a backpack in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it was Ansel Adams, the ultimate American artist explorer of his day, who broke free of this literalist approach by using his brilliant understanding of the relationships between light, film, and chemistry that allowed him to create imagery that was greater than the mere sum of its parts, thus allowing the photographer to imbue his own values into the finished print. Adams' love of the natural world and commitment to his art changed the course of American environmentalism, which, of course, at the time he was doing this was in its formative years. Specific time, specific place, specific date. all of which indeed in the early development of my craft, when I started working in photography, was the very point of the effort. Indeed, photography was invented for this replication of the real world. It was its purpose for being. It's a uniquely human undertaking to want to have a deeper understanding of the world we live in. And when you take a look around at Tony's work, every piece with all of its wondrous beauty, it's the detail of the artifacts, the detail and care he put into the painting, all of it enriches the viewing experience. As someone who studied Ansell's work for many years, I longed to make my own mark like most artists do. And one of the things I recognized almost immediately is that for the average viewer, if you already know what the subject of the image is, for instance, the Yosemite Valley, a veil comes down. I know the answer that is being posed by that photograph. I know where that place is. And once you take the image and interpret it through what you know, you're no longer experiencing the piece. So I saw that photographing recognizable landscapes was to shoot myself in the foot. And I promised I would never shoot in national parks. I'll never forget when I was at the Ansel Adams Gallery and they saw this piece and others, they were so excited. Well, this is all really great. What do you have of the Yosemite Valley? And I said, nothing. And they thought, this guy's crazy. They said, that's what people come here for. I said, I understand, but I don't shoot national parks. So they thanked me and sent me on my way. Oh, by the way, this image, Archilarius Ranch. This is one of my more iconic images. In the background is the Ansel Adams Wilderness, everything beyond this cinder cone. This is the headwaters of the Owens River and a ranch that I have visited every year for, thinking 40 years now. Very special place. So, given the history of my medium, given that it was designed to be specific about documenting places that other people can't get to, and my history as a photographer for these different organizations, the Peninsula Open Space Trust, Sempervirens Fund, Crystal Springs Watershed, and Jasper Ridge, that the anonymity of place and the subjective nature of my imagery has driven me further and further away from the literal and closer to the mystery, closer to the abstraction that life is. This view, standing knee-deep in water, rushing over the top of Searsville Dam during the New Year's Eve flood of 2010. So after 25 years of landscape photography, I started getting very frustrated because no matter how wonderful I thought the photograph was or how easily interpreted it was, people would look and say, wait, where'd you take that picture? And it seemed as though my efforts, no matter how abstract I made my landscape work, my efforts to break through our unconscious habits of seeing had fallen short. I recalled during this conversation I was having in my own head that in the late 1980s, I'd been experimenting with fiber optic light and light painting. This piece, titled First Light, was made at a painter friend's studio with her paint-splattered walls, and I asked her if I could photograph them. So I went there at night and focused my view camera on this wall, and I then ran the fiber optic, think of it as a small flashlight, around in a square to illuminate this as a mat for my finished piece inside. So the way it works is you focus the camera, you open the shutter so you're exposing the film, but if there's no light in the room, you're not making any exposure on the film. So you then use the fiber optic, just like this, to illuminate the areas of the subject that you want transposed and exposed on the film. So I did a number of experiments this way, and what I remembered about it was utterly unpredictable, very difficult, and just a lot of fun. Because no matter what you did, you didn't know what you had produced until the film was fully processed and you could look at it on a light box. So that was kind of nibbling around the edges of serendipity and how this might play a role in the future. But as I say, that was 30 years ago now. I had labored throughout my life in photography to make present that ineffable quality of life that we call transcendence. I'd started doing simple commercial photography, moved into black and white landscape, and now, with my 1996 residency at the Jurassic Resident Artist Program, I decided to do something new. So I used a miniature camera and film that is blind to visible light. It does not record light, it records heat energy, infrared energy. And I did a collection there, which was ultimately published as my book, 18 Days in June, which we published together to raise money and awareness about the Jurassic Artist Program. So I got a little bit closer. This piece, Witness, water is to infrared light what black velvet is to white light. Black velvet absorbs about 90% of white light. Water absorbs 99% of infrared. This is a creek. So we're seeing the rocks at the bottom of the creek and this single solitary plant on the sunlit stone adjacent to it. So while I was moving in the right direction, I was still working off a very literal base. Jurassic Day's End. When I returned from Italy, supervising the printing of the book, I knew something had to give. I'd been messing around with this for quite some time. Also, we had lost several members of our family to cancer. And I think, like most of us in the room, you know, we have that list. Well, someday I want to do this. Well, when my sister passed away at the age of 40, I realized that I don't have the time that I thought I did, and that it was time for something to give. So I was in the desert north of the Mexican border in Arizona, and I was thinking back on those cameraless images of the studio. And I was thinking about Sarah Adams, Ansel's granddaughter, who once showed me a very interesting cameraless set of images that I thought, someday I'll do that. And I thought I better do it now. So there in Arizona, I decided I would give up cameras, lenses, black and white film, and computers. And while I had no idea what I might do, I knew I was on the right path because the following morning I woke up as excited as a child on Christmas. Now I was in a new phase in my creative life, and now it's my desire to create art that's free of everything except that which created it. One long and frustrating year later, after multiple misstarts, thousands of dollars spent, and hundreds of sheets of film processed, I made this image, Alstroemeria. When I got to the lab and they gave me my box of film and I put this on the light table, I wept. In this single image, I saw all my years of work, the mystery that life can be, the beauty and the frailty, all on one piece of film. At long last, I had a new beginning. This was an artistic vision where there's no signposts, no directions, no support, no instruments, nothing. Not only that, it has a bewildering set of variables. So many variables that they include the altitude of the studio in which the image is made. They include the relative humidity in the room at the time the image is made. I get 10 times as much ultraviolet discharge at the studio in Santa Fe at 7,800 feet as I do at my studio at sea level over on the coast in Montana. So it's been quite a process of discovery. The experience of making these images is as different from traditional photography as anything you could imagine. The best analogy is from the domain of music. Black and white landscape work is to classical music what this work is to improvisational jazz. Black and white photography, if you include the camera, the lens, the shutter speed, the film, the chemistry you process it in, the paper you print, if you include everything, there's 16 variables. This process has over 50. It is impossible to manage, and it creates imagery that cannot be duplicated because the technique consumes the subject. So there's no going back. You can't say, oh, it's a little light or a little dark or a little this or that and go back and do it the next day. You don't have that plant anymore. There are no two plants on the planet that are alike. So it was a tremendous challenge, both creatively as well as intellectually and spiritually. I titled the portfolio, The Green Fuse, from the eponymous poem by Dylan Thomas, "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower." At last, I felt connected. I wanted something cheerful, so I went with Dylan Thomas. As a result of this new work, I was invited to move to Santa Fe to be the artist in residence at the world-renowned Santa Fe Institute, resulting in the portfolio Sangre de Cristo, Wildflowers of the Southern Rockies. This image, Eryngium Matrix, was a play on the research of complexity science for which the Institute is known. After 3 years in Santa Fe, I returned home to my little studio over on the coast side in Tierra and continued to stretch the envelope. This time, growing rainbow chard in my garden. I'm an avid gardener, as you might guess. And instead of 90 days seed to table, these I grew for 9 months. Because what I noticed was the longer they grew, the greater the color saturation in these stems. By the way, I should point out at this point that I don't do digital work. I make all my own chemistry from scratch. I make all my own prints, whether they're color or black and white. I make these in a friend's lab. Make all my black and white work in my own studio. And none of my work, color or black and white, has ever been touched by Photoshop. In original prints of these pieces, you can find bugs and dirt and fingerprints and all kinds of things that would be a heinous crime in Ansell's world. But this, to me, was about bringing it to a very real level. So this new collection, White Clematis, I called Rancho Corral de Tierra, which I learned from my work at POST, Peninsula Open Space Trust, was the 18th century Spanish land grant, one of the last land grants they made in California, and it happens to encompass Montera Mountain and the town where I live. So the move towards abstraction continues. This image was made by suspending these flowers, again from my garden, over the film using a pulley system so that the tips of the petals just barely caressed the film. So by this time, my life had become a dream. I was having 5 solo exhibitions a year. I was receiving the recognition and praise that I always hoped would come. And at long last, for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about making my mortgage payments. At that time, my coach and mentor, Daniel Miller, said to me during our monthly meeting, he said, "How's it going?" And I said, "Great, it's just going so great." And his response was, "It won't last." And he was right. He was right. During that summer, I was working late one night, as I used to, in my darkroom, and found myself transfixed by these tiny pieces of paper trim from my rotary trimmer. I was trimming some photographic paper. When I saw these silly little pieces of paper, I felt like I'd been taken under their spell. My health had been in mysterious and unfortunate decline for about 2 years, and I had pain and crippling fatigue and mental confusion. Saw 5 terrific doctors, all of whom misdiagnosed it. And by the end of that year, I could no longer remember the names of my sons, drive a car or be left home alone for my own safety. I had advanced neurologic Lyme disease from all of the thousands of nights slept out in fields and under the trees doing my landscape work. 6 years later, after that diagnosis, I came across these images and initially had no recollection of them, which happens to me a lot now. I have a lot of memory and cognitive issues. But I looked at these, and they look exactly like a micrograph of Borrelia burgdorferi, the causative agent of Lyme disease. So I looked back at when I made them, and I thought, oh, my art was trying to tell me what was wrong with me, but I didn't have the ears to hear it. So I awoke to a life that I had never imagined, much less prepared for. A friend of mine sent me this beautiful calligraphy, which is on the wall of the studio. So during those years, I spent a lot of time at home, which was new for me. But I was fortunate to have the love of my family and the support of my friends. And during that time, I probably learned more about my inner landscape than any other time in my life. A few years later, I discovered that while I was having trouble making new images, I could see some resonance between images that I had made in the past, such as this piece, some kind of blue. I started working on things that were broken. In this case, rodent bones from an owl pellet in the forest where my wife and I live, and sea glass. So this is 3 pieces of film that I put together using Photoshop. That's my one use. By the way, there are a couple prints here. The rainbow charred pieces over here. They're in the dark right now. And the reeds and water image is over here. So afterwards you can see, I hate showing my work like this. They are so much more grand as an original print, but you got to work with what you've got. So I started putting images together. And by studying things broken and trying to make things of beauty and resonance out of them, I found eventually made my peace with my illness. Here's another one, 3 different images that were made individually. And when I was playing in the darkroom, the 3 of them ended up on the light table together. Looks like they were designed to be made together, so I made this piece, Woodland Forest Floor. All 3 of these were made during a winter residency at the Jurassic Ranch up on top of Kings Mountain. In 2010, I was invited to be a guest at Stanford's Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve, but with the exception of this one image, the challenge proved entirely too great for someone spending 20 hours a day in bed. So I made this one piece there using a piece of antique glass and a buckeye cluster from one of the trees there at the preserve. This image, Green Mandala, is a classic example of the simplicity that can be found in the beauty, balance, and harmony that can be discerned in the natural world. Now, I imagine at this point there's a lot of questions about these images. And anytime I talk about photography, photography is the most technique-obsessed art form there is. I used to tell my students that if sculptors talked about their hammers and chisels the way we talk about our lenses and megapixels, that sculpture would have been put in the outhouse of the art world for its first 150 years too. It is a conversation that, while useful technically, it adds nothing to the experience of the art. So I tend to resist doing that. That's why I've been showing you these without discussing how they're made. One great quote that I like when it comes to this kind of thing, John Cowles, who wrote that every answer is a form of death. Getting back to, what is that? Oh, it's the Yosemite Valley. Next, Being in the question. I wanted to make photographs that ask questions that aren't answered and that challenge people and the way they think. So I appreciate your being willing to sit with these without knowing how they were made. there are times where it's very useful, especially when it comes to the treks that our host has made. So one of the things I did, one of the problems of this process is you don't know what the result is. Well, there's a lot of problems with it. One is that each sheet of film costs $40. I've gone through over 4,000 to make 105 images. And also, you have no way of knowing what the result is going to be. Back when I had a commercial studio, we would set up the view camera and make a Polaroid. And then we would show it to our client having coffee, and they would say, oh, that's just what I want, and they would sign it, and then we would commit it to film. You can't do that with this. I got electrocuted several times by attempting to use Polaroid before I remembered that all the Polaroid chemical sacks are lined with electrically conducting silver. So I realized I could make these images in black and white, I could process and proof them, and within 10 or 15 minutes, at least have some general idea about whether or not my time and my money was being well spent. So I started making these as kind of a short form look. And over time, I amassed quite a few of them. And because I had sworn off black and white film along with the other traditional tools, it took me a while to look at them, but once I did, I realized this was something that could really stand on its own. A gift return. This is a Japanese maple from my dear friends Claire and Jay, who are here tonight. That's the source of that title. Fiddleheads. And carriage glass lichen. So, there's two questions people ask. One is, how do you do it? And the second one is, did you invent this? So we're going to talk about the second question first. Considered the father of photography, Sir Fox Talbot, made this photogram of Erica mutabilis in 1839, just a couple years after he's credited with making the first photographic image. He was a scientist. He had a jar of silver salts, and he noticed one day that the side of the jar that was painting towards the outdoors had turned black. And he turned it, and it was white on the outside. And he thought, oh. He thought, well, if I put that on a piece of paper, maybe I could make an image. So he did, and he made an image just like this. And at the end of the day, he was ecstatic, and as he peeled up the plant, oh my God, there it is, in perfect, faithful, documented form. And as he watched it, the whole thing turned black because he hadn't figured out how to fix the image. But in the years that followed, he did. And so this is the basis of my technique. The second tool that I use is fiber optic light. In the 1860s, Daniel Culloden made some pocket money by doing a parlor trick, going to the well-to-do and doing this trick after dinner. And he would take a pan and he would put a key or a coin in it, would show it to everyone, and then would fill the pan with water, put it on the floor, and turn the lights out. And he would then take this tank of water with an arc lamp behind it, and he would pull this gate here so this stream of water would come out, and when it would hit the pan, everyone would gasp because all the light from the arc lamp would be brightly illuminating that tray. And it was quite an astounding trick. And it's just based on the internal refraction of light. It bounces off the inside of this. And this is the birth of fiber optics, without which there would be no Silicon Valley. So that's the second tool I use. The third tool was invented by this couple, Alexandra and Semyon Kirlian, Russian. She was a kindergarten teacher. He was a small appliance repairman in Leningrad. And one day, quite by accident, he ran an electric charge through his hand. And when he did, he saw what he believed was the aura that surrounds all living things. He and his wife were devout spiritualists. They were tarot card readers and so on. And they believed in their heart of hearts that there is an aura that surrounds all living things and that it can be detected in some way. So when he first got that shock, they both quit their jobs and spent the next 40, 50 years trying to prove that this is the aura that surrounds all living things. This was a self-portrait I did of my left hand in 2000, and this has now become known throughout the world as a Kirlian photograph. So let's now talk about how I make these things. Starting with Fox Talbot's photogrammetry, I take my 8 by 10 inch piece of film, I put it on my easel. My easel is a piece of sheet metal sandwiched between 2 pieces of acrylic and floating in a bath of liquid silicone. That's got a spark plug cable, like the one under the hood of your car that you drove here tonight in, and it's welded to the back of the sheet metal and goes to an 80,000 volt Tesla coil. So I lay the film on the acrylic. I then organize the plant on the film the way I see it in my mind's eye. By the way, this is done in total darkness. There's no wavelength of light this film is blind to, so you have to work in total darkness. And I then connect a battery jumper cable in all its elegance to the stem of the plant off screen and to a ground source so that I don't get electrocuted. And then sometimes I put a piece of plate glass or frosted glass over it. In this case, there was nothing over the top of it. So now I'm ready to go. So I turn on the Tesla coil, issue a pulse of 80,000 volts of electricity, which comes to the sheet metal, through the acrylic, through the film, onto the plant, and then down the cable to ground. And at the moment I do that, the electrons ionize the air surrounding the subject and throws off a tremendous amount of ultraviolet light, as you could see from my self-portrait. So if I stopped there, this would look exactly like the self-portrait, black with some ultraviolet on there. So the next step is I take a fiber optic probe, the diameter of a human hair, so think flashlight the size of a human hair, and I paint with light. So the easel is typically on a flat surface. So if this were the fiber optic, I would be singularly illuminating anything I want to expose to the film and avoiding these black areas for aesthetic reasons, but I always want to have a shadow and I always want to have the natural colors. And again, I want to emphasize, everybody thinks these colors came from a computer. This is our world, friends. The world is full of color and design and beauty, and it's all there if we take the time to see it. Field mustard. So at the end, this is my work product. This is an 8 by 10 inch piece of film in a plastic sheet. And whatever's on that film is what ends up in the print. If there's too many bugs, too much dirt, maybe I won't print it. But whatever's here goes on. I wanted to remind everyone who's so excited about the digital revolution that creativity was around a lot longer than computers and all the rest, and that we don't have to have those tools. The whole photography community, you can't find a sponsorship for anything unless it's based in digital imaging now. There's no more Kodak, there's no more Fuji. Working with film is truly an archaic process. So I'm going to wrap up now. In 1993, shortly before his untimely passing, Wallace Stegner introduced me to Harold Gilliam, who became the writer for the introduction to my first book, The Unseen Peninsula. Earlier in his career, Wally wrote that hard writing makes for easy reading. And over the last 40 years, I've seen that this is true for making photographs as well. For me, hard shooting makes for joyful viewing. One of the many reasons I don't work in a digital format. So to close, I'd like to share an opening paragraph from Stegner's The American West as Living Space, a series of lectures he gave at the University of Michigan in 1986. If there is such a thing as being conditioned by climate and geography, and I think there is, It's the West that's conditioned me. It has the forms and lights and colors that I respond to in nature and in art. If there is a Western speech, I speak it. If there is a Western character or personality, I'm sure I'm some variant of it. If there is a Western culture in the small c anthropological sense, I have certainly not escaped it. It has to have shaped me. I may have even contributed to it in some minor ways, for culture is a pyramid to which all of us brings a stone. Thanks very much for being here this evening.